All right, now I'll do my screen share here. There we go. Okay, welcome back, folks. We have been into the settlement of the Ozarks the last few weeks, and as I was telling our person here that I'm not going to be here next week, so you're going to get a break. You won't have to listen to me for a week. But when we get back, we're going to start the Civil War in the Ozarks. A really interesting topic. The Civil War was really a really important part of the Ozarks history, and really a pretty dreadful time in Ozarks. But anyway, today we're going to talk about the last of the immigration movements into the Ozarks. So, here, so foreign-born immigrants. We've looked at the Scots-Irish, which was the primary early immigrants and the ancestors of most of the long-term residents of the Ozarks. Last week, we looked at the immigration and the use of African Americans in the Ozarks. Not a pretty picture, but I'm one of those historians who believe you got to talk about the warts as well as the beauty spots. So today, our Ozarker of the day. Now, a pretty young kid there, born in Crane, Missouri, actually was raised by his grandparents. And if you were a fan of 1980s television, you might better remember him as this guy right here, Don Johnson. Don Johnson was raised about 20 miles southwest of Springfield, and native-born Ozarker, and made a big splash in the TV and the movies. Still does some work, although his daughter is much better known now. She's also an actress. So Don Johnson, our Ozarker of the day. Pardon me while I get a drink. So today we're going to talk about the foreign-born immigrants in the Ozarks, the rest of the ones that came in. Now, we know that most pre-Civil War immigrants to the Ozarks came from what we call the Upland South, that area of Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, the Carolinas, and they were almost totally comprised of Scots-Irish ancestry. So the earliest immigrants and the ancestors of most of the long-term settlers of the Ozarks were Scotch-Irish, but that began to change. After the Civil War, the source of immigration changed pretty dramatically. It started coming mainly from Northern European countries. Germany, in particular, was a huge source of immigrants into the Ozarks. A lot of Scandinavians, Swedish, Norwegians, those areas were really big. There were also some Italians, not as many. It didn't seem like the Southern European people quite saw the Ozarks as someplace they wanted to live. They tend to gather more into the bigger cities. But the Germans in particular were really important in the settlement of the Ozarks after the Civil War. And then, of course, more recently, we've had two other immigration waves. One of them took place in the 1970s with the Vietnamese refugees from the Vietnam War. And then more recently, from about 1990s on, we've seen a very large Hispanic population move into the Ozarks. So this is what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about primarily the Germans, some of these smaller groups of people like the Swedes and Italians, a few other little groups like that, and then finish up talking about the Vietnamese population that moved in the 70s and their influence, which has been really important, as you'll find out if you don't already know. So German immigration, how did this all take place? Well, Germany prior to 1870 was not a unified country. If you don't know, Germany was just an area of little duchies and kingdoms and principates, and just, there's about 300 of them. I mean, they were just really, really small. And they were all ruled by the aristocracy. And it was kind of just a hodgepodge. The German people really didn't have a unified culture in that sense. They all spoke the same language primarily, although different dialects, and they had some of the different, cultural traits. But for the most part, they politically were not unified at all. They also weren't totally unified religiously. The Lutherans in the Protestant Reformation had gained a very strong foothold in the northern part of what we now know as Germany, whereas the southern part still remained primarily Catholic. And if you were to go to Germany today, you would still see that pretty much to that degree. The southern part of Germany is still primarily Catholic. The northern part is primarily Lutheran. That's pretty common. Now, most people that lived in these little provinces, these little duchies and kingdoms and principates, they had it pretty rough, folks, because most people were poor, they were impoverished, they couldn't own land. There was a burgeoning middle class because they were very good artisans, and they were good with trades and all. But as far as property ownership, they just were absolutely left out in the cold because the land was tied up in these aristocratic families. And when one died, the next one came along and inherited it. And there just was no opportunity to buy land. It was all tied up by aristocratic families. So the result was they began to look for places to move. Before the Civil War and particularly after the Civil War in the United States, they began to really make movements towards America. Now, this was encouraged to a great degree by Germans who would come to America and then write what was called travel books, pamphlets. They would come somewhere and they would just absolutely write beautiful scenarios about a certain area. And the Germans would be published and they would be read by the Germans back home. And they would come in mass. They would take up and there would be hundreds of them get together and come to one particular area. One of those areas was St. Louis, Missouri. A man by the name of Godfrey Duden absolutely fell in love with the Missouri River Valley and the upper Mississippi River Valley and the area around St. Louis. He said it reminded him so much of Germany. Now, I've never been to Germany. I most certainly have been to St. Louis and the area around it. I've talked to people who have been to Germany and even some who've lived there, and they say it's not quite the same, So maybe Mr. Duden kind of, used a little hyperbole to get people to move to the Ozarks. But for whatever reason, he absolutely really was one person, and he wasn't the only one, that encouraged people to move to St. Louis and therefore into the Ozarks. Now, if you know anything about St. Louis, you know that it has a huge German population still today. I mean, it was really a very large population. At one point in time, there were over 7 million Germans that moved into the United States in the 19th century, and a lot of them settled in the St. Louis, Missouri River Valley area and on down into the Ozarks. Now, this is a map of the German states of the mid-19th century. This is kind of an outline of present-day modern Germany, the dark is. And you can see that for the most part, and these are just the big ones, this might look like there's not 300, but trust me, all these were broken into even smaller little areas. For instance, this is basically an area called Brandenburg, and this is Pomerania. This is Silesia, Posen. Over here you have Saxony. Down here you have Bavaria. But there would be little dukedoms all up and down Bavaria. So, even though it looks like there's not 300 there, trust me, there were just a lot of little individual kingdoms and duchies. And all this land was tied up by just probably a few thousand families. You just didn't have an opportunity to really grow. So that's why they came into the Ozarks. Now, by 1850, prior to the Civil War, over a third of the population of St. Louis was made up of Germans. Folks, that was over 78,000 people. St. Louis was the fourth largest city in the United States prior to the Civil War at one point in time. And the German population was just huge there. I mean, they were just really gigantic. They were very, very much pro-union and anti-slavery. And when the Civil War breaks out, as you will see in the next few weeks when we talk about the Civil War, the Germans played a very large part in eventually keeping Missouri a Union state. It was really fought over in a guerrilla war type affair, but it basically stayed within the Union. It was kind of went back and forth at times, but the Germans played a very large part in making sure that it did not go into the Confederacy. And they were very anti-slavery because they had all but been slaves themselves, economic slaves for sure. Of course, they were the source of the large brewing industry, which came to dominate St. Louis. I think we all know about Anheuser-Busch, and there were lots of other breweries besides Anheuser-Busch, but they were by far and away the largest of the ones, and became the dominant brewery really in the United States. After the Civil War, there were four distinct groups of German immigrants who began to move into the Ozarks. So after the Civil War, you begin to see a lot of these Germans move out of the St. Louis area and coming directly from Germany that begin to move more into the interior of the Ozarks. And they were comprised, first of all, of scholars. There was not very much academic freedom in Germany prior to unification. Frankly, there wasn't very much academic freedom after unification. But there were a lot of scholars that just felt like that they could not really pursue their academic pursuits. And if you know anything about the German people, you know they're very strongly academic people, and they have an excellent educational system, and they really were leaders in writing and the arts, and they just felt like they were being stymied by this aristocratic group of people that would not let them express their freedom like they wanted to. There was also that group of people that I mentioned that were in search of artistic freedom. And again, the Germans were extremely rigid in what they would allow, kind of black and white. They stayed within the lines. If there was a highway and there was lines, they stayed within them. A lot of groups of people like the Scotch Irish, they might take off on a country road, not the Germans. The Germans just were really very black and white, and they had a certain pedigree, which they really believed they just had to stay within. There was also religious separatists they were seeking religious freedom. As I mentioned, the northern part of Germany was extremely Lutheran, whereas the southern part was very much Catholic, and people that didn't necessarily agree with those religious ideas wanted to escape it. And so a lot of them moved to escape that. And of course, there were the peasants. There were those people that just absolutely felt like if they were ever going to improve their economic or social status, they had to get out of the German area because there was no way they were ever going to grow. The idea of owning a farm in Germany was just non-existent. That wasn't going to happen. If you didn't already own one, if you had not inherited a farm, you weren't going to own one. That was just all there was to it. And a lot of peasants wanted to be their own landowners. That's something that we see throughout history. Here's an example of a German Union soldier. The Germans made up a really large percentage of the military on the Union side that fought in the Civil War. Again, you're going to find that out when we talk about the Germans and Scotch Irish were both heavily involved in the military in the Civil War. So where did these Germans go when they moved into the Ozarks? Where'd they go? Now, first thing you need to understand is that unlike the previous immigrants, they tended to group together. Now, I've already told you, I'm a Scotch-Irish ancestry. And my wife laughed. She said, I know you. If you had your choice, you would be living in 1,000 acres of timber with a creek running through it and a log cabin right in the middle, away from everybody. And, it's not that I don't like people. It's not that I'm not, I don't love to be around people. It's just that the Scotch-Irish people have just mindset. They like to be able to spread their wings and don't like to be hemmed in. The Germans, on the other hand, wanted to stay together. They wanted to keep their heritage. They wanted to keep their language. They wanted to keep their traditions. The Scotch-Irish, for the most part, really couldn't care. They cared less about that. They wanted to be Americans. They weren't interested in being Irish anymore. Now, they were proud of their Irish ancestry, don't get me wrong, but they were interested in becoming Americans. The Germans were more interested in being German Americans. And you see this in a lot of different ethnic groups. It's not just the Germans, but they definitely tended to group together. They were much more clannish. And so if you were to go to small communities and even larger cities in the Ozarks, you would see a disproportionate amount of German names in some areas. For instance, Washington, Missouri has a very large German population. Of course, Herman is just absolutely huge as far as German traditions. We're going to see a little film here on Herman in a moment. If you don't know anything about Herman, Herman just is a very important tourist city in the Ozarks, the Upper Ozarks, that's dedicated towards preserving its German heritage. Jefferson City, the capital, has a very large German population, as does Boonville, as does a town called Westphalia. Obviously, it's Westphalia is one of those principalities in Germany. There were even smaller towns within the interior of the Ozarks, and there were more than these, but these are four that I'm very familiar with. There was a little town called Freistatt, west of Aurora, Missouri, about 40 miles west of here, which has a huge German population at one point in time. They're still noted for their harvest festival, their Erntefest in August. And there's upwards of anywhere from 15 to 20,000 people come to Freistatt on that weekend and eat traditional German food and drink beer and play games and listen to music. And the little town itself probably doesn't have more than a couple hundred people today, but it has a huge festival, traditional Ozarks festival or German festival. Little town of Lockwood has a huge German population. Little town just a few miles from here, Billings. I'm very familiar with Billings. Billings was only about 5 miles from where I grew up. It has a huge German population, ancestry in it. And Springfield. Springfield has a very large German population. So these are just some of the towns. There's more than these, but these are some of the towns that you would find in the Ozarks that has a disproportionate amount of German people in it, ancestry, that people can trace their ancestry back to German immigrants in the 19th century. Here's a picture of a German settlement in Herman, one of the businesses. And I've got about a little 5 or 6 minute clip I thought you might enjoy. It actually was filmed by a St. Louis TV station, but it's a really interesting clip. It shows you all about Herman. And like I said, if you want to see German settlements in Missouri, you need to go to Herman. That's all there is to it. So
I'm back, Maurice and Kristen here. We talked about the beautiful day. You know what? We're talking about how more and more people also are getting vaccinated. And with that, people are starting to make plans to travel again, Kristen.
Yes, they are. Some of you may want to start close to home. And if you do, you might consider Herman. As I found out in a recent visit, this beautiful river town is about so much more than just Oktoberfest.
Herman has been voted the most beautiful town by several magazines throughout the state. So we're the most beautiful town in Missouri. And if you come, you'll see why.
About 80 miles west of St. Louis, along the banks of the Missouri River, lies this small town bursting with German heritage.
Herman was actually founded in 1837. It reminded them of their home back in Germany with the beautiful rolling hills, the river, and the great countryside.
The German heritage is reflected in its cuisine. They love their beer and brats.
We make in-house 45 flavors of bratwurst, 12 flavors of bacon, 10 flavors of summer sausage, 7 flavors of craft beer.
This three-time Hall of Famer Wurstmeister produces world-class bratwurst and sausage.
We also have available barbecue items for folks who don't want to go to the German side. We got the American side. Pit smoked brisket, pulled pork, barbecue ribs, baby back ribs, pork steaks, and pork burgers.
While Mike has won numerous awards, he's won gold multiple times at the most prestigious sausage competition in the world, held in Frankfurt, Germany. Here at the Wurst House, you can enjoy the best of the worst.
Herman is definitely put on the map because of our wineries, even pre-prohibition. But now we are so excited. We also have distilleries that are popping up. Cheers. Virtual cheers.
We visited the tasting room of the Blackshire Distillery, which is right in downtown. They produce vodka, gin, whiskey, and brandy.
If you're familiar with the Blackshire horses, it pays homage to those Blackshire horses that are actually out at the Herman farm where the actual distillery is.
The bartender showed us how to make one of their specialties, the smoked pineapple and cardamom old fashioned.
It's really good.
Another of many options, their blackberry lemonade. Just a short walk away, you'll find the Tin Mill, the only craft brewery in town. It's located in a historic grain processing plant right in downtown. On offer, you'll find traditional German beers, all made in-house. There are 20 beers on tap with an ever-changing lineup. I was able to taste the Midnight Whistle. Good. But ordering a flight also looks like a great way to sample. There are 11 wineries in the Herman area. This is Stonehill Winery, established in 1847. It's the oldest winery in the state of Missouri, and at one time was the second largest wine producer in the United States. The wines made here have won a lot of awards. They've even won medals at 7 World's Fairs. Coming here for a wine tasting is a popular activity. I liked the Golden Rhine. That is excellent. I think I know where I'm bringing my husband on our next trip. There is also a restaurant on site, and live music is performed on the hill during the warmer months. So this is the entrance to the cellar? Wow. Your visit isn't complete until you head underground to see the largest series of cellars in the U.S. They took 7 years to hand dig. When the pandemic is over, tours of the cellars will resume. If adult beverages aren't quite your thing, how about some history?
We have a new caboose museum. I have a mini museum on 2nd Street myself with fire memorabilia. And of course, we have the Herman Fire Company Museum that we're in there right now.
Everything you see here is Herman firefighting equipment that previous generations held onto. These items were stored away in barns for a long time, and now, years later, Herman is fortunate enough to be able to show it off.
This here is the Consequence. This is a handmade pumper here in Herman. It was built in 1856. It's an irreplaceable piece of our history of Herman.
Check out the intricate detailing on this piece, like this little bird underneath. There's plenty here for you shoppers as well.
There's over 30 shops with leather shops and the toy shops, chocolate shops. We got all kinds of shops, boutiques and antiques.
Herman is an easy drive from St. Louis. Or you can ditch your car, take the Amtrak. The train drops you off right in downtown, which is small enough to be walkable. If you're a little more adventurous, you could bike or hike into Herman on the Katy Trail. The trail passes right through the northern part of Herman. However you choose to arrive, you won't have any trouble finding a place to stay.
This is the Herman Crown Suites. It's one of our boutique hotels here in town. We have over 140 lodging establishments in town.
If you'd like to get some exercise or just a bit more into nature, head 10 miles west. Here you'll find the Grand Bluffs Conservation Area, which features a 2-mile out and back trail. This steep hike leads to a scenic overlook deck atop 300-foot-high Dolomite bluffs, providing spectacular views of the Missouri River. It's accessible year-round.
Take advantage of all of the wineries, the breweries, distilleries, our wonderful restaurants, our shops, and then the great hiking and biking that we have all around our city.
In Herman, Kristen Cornett, News 4. I have to admit, I had never been to Herman before. So when I was given this opportunity to do these pieces, it was one of the first places I was like, got to go there, right?
Yeah.
And it did not disappoint. We're actually going to be doing these.
Okay, so that was our little virtual trip tour to Herman, Missouri. The Ozarks in Missouri in general, folks, is a huge wine producing region. Remember, we have what's called a karst type of topography and geology. And remember, that's the same kind of topography and geology you're going to find in southern France, which is where the area that's really noted for their wineries. So it shouldn't be a surprise that Missouri has a large wine producing area, as well as, obviously a beer producing area. This is a typical picture I found on the internet of a little town called FREISTATT. And I mentioned the Untitled they have there. I love this picture for one reason. If you'll look, the bride is wearing black. Now, all the other ladies seem to be wearing mostly white, but the bride is wearing black. She's not wearing a white dress. That was not really very popular for a long time, because after all, folks, what good were white dresses to a farm woman? She couldn't really use one after that. And so this was a kind of an unusual thing for us to see dressed in dark colored clothing here. So who were these Germans? Well, one of my great-great-grandfathers was a German immigrant from this area, a man by the name of ELISHA Randolph Couch. He was one of my great-great-grandfathers that moved in here. His great-grandfather had actually come from southwestern area of Germany, around the Baden area in the 1700s, and moved into the United States very early on, prior to the Revolutionary War. Settled in an area we would now know as South Carolina, eventually moved into the Alabama territory. And his great-grandson, Elijah, ended up in Texas in the 1850s, and he would marry the widowed Sarah Jane Gray. If you've been with me, you might remember Sarah Jane Gray was my great-great-grandmother who came across the Trail of Tears. She was a full-blooded Cherokee, and she had gone to Texas with her husband, who ended up being killed by bushwhackers. And she was left widowed with 4 young children in frontier Texas. And Elijah took her in, married her, and they ended up moving back to the Ozarks, living on Sarah Jane Gray's father's farm, which is located on the Wilson's Creek battlefield today. If you were to go to Wilson's Creek battlefield and take the driving tour, one of the first areas you see off to your left is the old Edgar Cemetery, and that's where Sarah Jane Gray and Elijah Randolph Couch are buried, as well as Mary Elizabeth Couch, who was my great-grandmother, her daughter. This is a photograph of Elijah and Sarah Jane Gray. That was her first name, Gray, before she married Couch. So there were other foreign immigrants besides the Germans. For instance, there was a group of Swedish settlers that settled in 2 areas in the Ozarks. One of them was an area called Swedenborg, which is up around the Waynesville area. And the other one is a little town west of Aurora, between Monette and Aurora, called Verona, down in a little valley. Just so happens that's where my wife came from. My wife was the granddaughter of Swedish immigrants into the United States in the 1800s. There was a group of French settlers that moved south of Monette, as well as some Polish groups of people that moved into a little area called Pulaski Fields in Berry County. There was a large group of Italians that moved into Town in North Arkansas and a little area called Rosati. If you ever traveled up Interstate 44 between Rolla and can't think of what the name of the town is, or St. James, you might have noticed that there's a lot of grape vineyards right there. And that was actually the location, the little town of Rosati at one time. So there was a huge amount of Italians that moved into that area. There was actually a group of Hungarians. We don't really think too much about Hungarians in the Ozarks, but there was a group of them that moved in around Poplar Bluff and still have a lot of descendants that live in the Poplar Bluff area. And there were even several Swiss immigrants that moved in the Altus, Arkansas area, and established the nationally known Whitaker Winery, which is, again, one of the better known wineries in the United States. So these are just some of them. Now, I mentioned my wife was a descendant of a Swedish immigrant. She was the granddaughter of Emil Johan Carlson, who changed his name to John Carlson. Born in Sweden, 1866, he and his twin brother, August, left Sweden in the early 1800s and immigrated to America. Apparently, he left primarily to avoid the draft. We don't think of Sweden as being a militaristic country today, but Sweden was actually a very strong military power in the 1800s. And they didn't want to serve in the armed forces, so they came to America and ended up kind of becoming almost what we'd call indentured servants. They were sponsored by a group of Swedish immigrants that had already moved to the Verona area by the name of the Appelquist. Again, a very well-known name in this area. And they paid for the Carlsons to come over, and they sponsored them. And the Carlsons worked for them just long enough to pay off their debt, and then they were free to go wherever they wanted. It was a very honorable thing. It wasn't like they were forced to do anything. It was an honorable working arrangement. He lived in Springfield originally after he got here, and then he started working for the Springfield Wagon Company, which was huge in Springfield, and married another Swedish immigrant by the name of Hilda Eglund. And they ended up moving to Freistatt and living on that little German community, raising their sheep, having children, one of which was my wife's mother, Ellen Lenora Carlson. This is Emil and Hilda. Now, that's a very early picture of my wife's grandmother. They were both young when they were married. I don't have a good picture of Emil when he was young. Apparently he was kind of camera shy, but this is a photograph of him. This would have been probably in the 1930s, 40s. This would have been Hilda probably around the turn of the century. So that was my wife's grandmother and grandfather from Sweden. She actually lived with Emil and her mother and father for a short period of time, and she knew him very well before he died. So there were some other immigrants. For instance, in 1970s, after the Vietnam War, there was a huge influx of Vietnamese into the Ozarks. The reason was because one of the resettlement areas for the Vietnamese refugees from the war was Fort Chaffee, Arkansas. And once they were released, as happened a lot of times, they tended to stay here. There were other areas in the United States. For instance, the area around Houston, Texas was big with Vietnamese refugees. But there was a huge amount of them, and there is still a very large Vietnamese population in Southwest Missouri today. In fact, they are probably best known for their restaurants. If you're unfamiliar with Springfield, let me tell you, there's a cashew chicken restaurant on every corner. In fact, the case, this is not a lie. I read a newspaper article about a year or two ago that said that there were over 600 restaurants in Springfield. If you don't know anything about Springfield, for whatever reason, we eat out more than any place in America. I mean, I'm telling you, there are so many restaurants in Springfield, and over 100 of these, 1/6 of the restaurants in Springfield were cashew chicken restaurants. They are just gigantic. Now, our cashew chicken, if you don't know, is a little bit different than traditional cashew chicken. It was created by the name by man of Leong, and I'm going to show you here in a minute a picture of him. They still get together every year. There's a huge festival in Carthage, Missouri, called MARIAN Days. A lot of these Vietnamese that came over as refugees were Catholic from the French when the French occupied Vietnam. And they have this huge festival every year in Carthage called MARIAN Days, where they get together and it's kind of like a reunion and they celebrate their Catholic heritage. And there's over 100,000 people come into the little town of Carthage during this period of time. More recently, there has been a large group of Hispanics have moved into the Ozarks. And you will find a lot of them in Lawrence, Berry, some in Greene County, a lot of them in the Bentonville, Springdale, Rogers corridor down in Northwest Arkansas, primarily because they have been employed in the huge chicken plants that are prevalent in this area. Tyson Foods is the biggest chicken producer in America, and they're centered in Bentonville, Arkansas. Bentonville is between the Tyson chicken and Walmart. They're a pretty wealthy little community, to say the least. This is Mr. David Leong with his world famous cashew chicken. His cashew chicken is called Springfield style cashew chicken. And he found out that Ozarkers didn't particularly care for the traditional type of cashew chicken he was familiar with. They wanted their chicken breaded and deep fried. And he experimented with different sauces. And today, his restaurant, which is now run by his son, is just very popular and has been for decades in the Ozarks. By the way, Mr. Leong just passed away just this last year. We frequent this restaurant quite a bit, my wife and I do, and he would be there every morning. He didn't work anymore, but he would show up with his shirt and his tie, and he would sit over in his little booth, and he just kind of enjoyed being there. And people would go up, you could go up and talk with him. A very interesting man, lived to be in his late 90s and showed up to work every day almost till he died, wearing his tie. And people enjoyed talking with him. I had several conversations with him. Very interesting man. This is a photograph of MARIAN Days in Carthage, Missouri, and you can see just a huge crowd that shows up there. And Carthage, again, is not a very large city. I mean, it's probably got 10, 12,000 people in it at the most. But there can be up to 100,000 people show up on MARIAN Days on the weekend. This is a grocery store in Monette, Missouri. Monette, Missouri has about 5,000 people in it. This, if you'll notice, the name of it is La Plaza. I think that's I can't even say it. Okay. It's a Mexican grocery store. It serves the Hispanic community. There are so many Hispanics in that area that they have their own grocery store with their traditional Mexican and Hispanic foods. You won't see this in even a town the size of Springfield. We have grocery stores that have areas of their stores that are basically serve the Hispanic community, but I don't know of a grocery store in Springfield, which is 250,000 people metro area, that has their own grocery store. Little town of 5,000 has their own grocery store. That tells you something right there. Here's the 2020 census statistics that I was able to come up with. I thought you might be interested in this. The Asian population is around 2% in Springfield. Republic, my little community where I came from, actually a little bit more, 2.5% or so. Ozark, Nixa, Ozark has a very small Asian population. Nixa a little bit more. Willard, that just totally shocks me. I can't hardly believe that there's no Asians in Willard. Willard's a pretty thriving community on the northwest side of Springfield. Joplin has about the same as Springfield. Branson has a fairly large population. Monette, about 1.5%. West Plains, almost negligible again. But that's some of the Asian population that you would find. This is the Hispanic population. Now, this is where you really get your eyes open. Springfield has a pretty significant amount of Hispanic population, about the same as their African American community. Republic, about the same as the Asian. Ozark, quite a bit more Hispanics than Asians. Nixa has a very large Hispanic population for that small city. Willard, again, has a pretty good size. Joplin actually has 5%. Branson has a very large Hispanic population. That's because of the service industry again. But look at Monette. Monette is that town where I showed you where that grocery store was. Almost a third of the people living in Monette today are Hispanic. My wife grew up 5 miles from Monette. And she told me that when she was a young girl, she never saw anyone of Hispanic origin in Monette. It just didn't happen. And now it makes up almost a third of the population. So, as you can see, the Ozarks is still a very homogeneous area. It is primarily still an area of Scotch-Irish, white people with some Germans, but it does have a growing, diverse population, particularly in some areas. And so it'll be interesting to see how that changes over the next few decades in the Ozarks. It's changing throughout the United States, and we're just kind of like a little microcosm of that. Okay, next week, I won't be here. I'm going to be out of town, and I'm not for sure where I'm going has internet facilities. So I've just chosen not to broadcast next week. I don't want to take a chance on not being able to do it if there's no internet facilities. But when we come back in 2 weeks, we're going to start studying and talking about the Civil War in the Ozarks. Extremely fascinating subject. The Civil War in the Ozarks is much more interesting than most people realize. It played a really heavy role in the outcome of the Civil War, and even more so, some of the aftermath of the Civil War. The 20, 30 years after the Civil War in the Ozarks was just a desperate time. And it was really the Civil War left the Ozarks in shambles. It really did. So that's it. We will see you next week. I hope you've enjoyed this today, and we will talk to you in 2 weeks.